The year was 1536, the month was May, and the air on Tower Hill was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the morbid anticipation of a crowd. Upon the scaffold, dark against the gray London sky, stood a man whose name was synonymous with power, wit, and revolution. This was not some common traitor or foreign spy. This was George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, brother to the Queen of England. He was a poet, a diplomat, a fervent reformer, and until a few weeks ago, the king's own companion and brother-in-law. Now he faced the headsman's axe, condemned for a crime so foul, so unnatural, it defied belief. Incest with his own sister, the Queen. How could a man so close to the sun be plunged into such an absolute darkness? The story of his fall is not merely a footnote to his sister's tragedy. It is a chilling testament to the brutal, carnivorous nature of Tudor power, a world where the whispers of a rival could become a death sentence, and the love of a king could curdle into a homicidal fury. And now please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to continue making videos like this every day, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. The ascent of the Boleyn family was a masterclass in ambition, a vertiginous climb fueled by the intellect of its children and the relentless drive of its patriarch, Sir Thomas Boleyn. From the provincial fields of Kent, Thomas propelled his family into the very heart of the European political cosmos, securing for his daughters, Mary and Anne, positions in the glittering, treacherous courts of France, and for his son, George, an education befitting a prince of the Renaissance. George was the male heir, the inheritor of the name, and he was polished into a perfect courtly diamond. He was handsome, prodigiously intelligent, and possessed a razor-sharp wit that could charm a room or draw blood in a debate. He spoke French fluently, was a gifted musician and poet, and moved with an easy grace that caught the eye of King Henry VIII himself. In the early days, before the great schism that would tear Christendom apart, George was more than just Anne's brother. He was a rising star in his own right, a favored companion of the king, a man who shared Henry's passion for theology, sport, and the new learning that was sweeping across the continent. This was the golden age for the Boleyns, a time when their power seemed limitless, their future inscribed in the stars. They were the embodiment of a new kind of aristocracy, one based not just on ancient bloodlines, but on talent, intellect, and proximity to the crown. George, with his charm and fierce intelligence, was the standard-bearer for this new world, a courtier who danced, debated, and hunted with the king, seemingly oblivious to the abyss that lay just beyond the torchlight of the royal court. The palace was a stage, and for a glorious, fleeting moment, George Boleyn was one of its most celebrated actors, his every word and gesture applauded by the king he so admired. It was a world of silk, gold, and whispered promises, a world built on the shifting sands of royal favor, a foundation that would prove to be as unstable as it was brilliant. The family had ascended together, a tight-knit unit of ambition and affection, and they would become inextricably linked in their tragic, bloody descent. George's fate was not an afterthought to Anne's. It was woven into the very fabric of her rise, a silent pact that meant her triumph was his, and her destruction would inevitably and horrifically be his as well. The seeds of his death were planted in the very gardens of his success, watered by the same royal attention that had made him great. George Boleyn was far more than a decorative courtier or the Queen's handsome brother. He was a prime mover, an intellectual engine driving the most radical transformation in English history. His commitment to religious reform was not a matter of political convenience, but a deep, burning conviction. He was a passionate evangelical, fluent in the theological arguments of the day, and a key member of the reformist faction at court that saw the Pope not as the vicar of Christ, but as a foreign power meddling in English affairs. He was a voracious reader of forbidden texts, of the works of Tyndale and Luther, and he engaged in fierce debates with the conservative faction, his sharp tongue and logical mind making him a formidable opponent. His personal library was a testament to his beliefs, filled with reformist treatises that, in another context, could have seen him burned for heresy. King Henry, himself a student of theology, found in George a brilliant and stimulating intellectual partner. They would spend hours discussing scripture, dissecting the arguments for royal supremacy, and building the theological and legal framework for the break with Rome. George was not merely echoing the king's desires, he was actively shaping them, providing the intellectual ammunition for the revolution. He was appointed to crucial diplomatic missions, sent to France to negotiate with King Francis I, a task that required immense delicacy, political acumen, and a profound understanding of the shifting alliances of Europe. He was a voice for England on the continental stage, arguing for the validity of Henry's new marriage and the legitimacy of his new church. He was also a powerful force in Parliament, using his position as Viscount Rochford to push through the legislative architecture of the Reformation, including the pivotal Act of Supremacy that declared Henry the head of the Church of England. In this, he was a direct collaborator with Thomas Cromwell, the other great architect of the new order. For a time, they were allies, two brilliant, low-born men reshaping a nation. But their alliance was one of necessity, not friendship, and the corridors of power were not wide enough for two such colossal ambitions. George was not a pawn. He was a kingmaker, a man who staked his life and his family's future on a radical new vision for England. He believed in the cause, and he believed in his sister, the woman who was the living symbol of that cause. His tragedy is that he was too successful, too visible, too brilliant. His intellectual fervor made him dangerous enemies among the old guard, and his proximity to the Queen made him a fatal liability when her star began to fall. He had helped build the scaffold of the new English state, never imagining that he himself would be one of the first to be led to it, a victim of the very power structure he had so passionately helped to create. The engine for this cataclysmic change, the vortex around which all politics, religion, and personal destinies swirled, was the king's great matter, Henry VIII's desperate, obsessive quest for a male heir, and his consuming passion for Anne Boleyn became the twin forces that would remake a kingdom and, in the process, seal George Boleyn's fate. For years, the court was held in a state of suspended animation as Henry sought an annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. This was not a simple legal proceeding. It was an international crisis that pitted England against the might of the Holy Roman Emperor, Catherine's nephew, and the spiritual authority of the Pope. George was thrust into the heart of this struggle, not just as a supportive brother, but as a key operative. He was part of the inner circle, privy to the secret negotiations, the legal arguments, and the escalating threats against the papacy. He saw firsthand the immense pressure on his sister, a woman living in a political limbo, not quite wife, not quite mistress. Her entire future depended on the king's notoriously fickle affections and the outcome of a theological battle that spanned all of Europe. The weight on the Boleyn family was immense. They had bet everything on Anne. Their wealth, their titles, their influence, their very lives were staked on her ability to succeed where Catherine had failed, to give Henry a son. The air at court grew heavy with suspense, the years of waiting stretching the nerves of everyone involved to the breaking point. George, ever the diligent diplomat and advocate, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, shoring up support, countering the propaganda of the Aragonese faction, and reassuring a king whose patience was wearing dangerously thin. When the break with Rome finally came and Anne was crowned queen in 1533, it was a moment of supreme triumph for the Boleyns. It seemed their gamble had paid off. George was at the zenith of his power, his sister was on the throne, and the future of England appeared to be in their hands, but their victory was built on a precipice. They had alienated the most powerful men in Europe, divided their own country, and made bitter enemies of the old aristocracy and the conservative clergy who viewed them as heretical usurpers. Their power was entirely contingent on one single biological fact: the birth of a prince. The arrival of Princess Elizabeth was a joy, but not the fulfillment of the prophecy. The clock was ticking, and the king's great matter, once a source of the Boleyns' ascent, was slowly, inexorably transforming into the instrument of their ruin. The pressure to produce an heir became a suffocating burden on Anne, and by extension, on George and the entire family. They were trapped in a narrative of their own making, a high-stakes drama where the final act had yet to be written, and the king, their patron and protector, was also their ultimate judge and potential executioner. To understand the sudden, violent downfall of the Boleyns, one must first understand the environment in which they operated. The Tudor court was not a government building but a viper's nest, a closed, incestuous ecosystem of ambition, paranoia, and surveillance. It was a world of suffocating intimacy, where the personal was always political, and the political was always deeply, violently personal. Every word was weighed, every glance interpreted, every friendship a potential alliance, and every rival a potential assassin of one's character, if not one's body. George Boleyn, with his quick wit and aristocratic confidence, thrived in this environment, but he was also uniquely vulnerable to its poisons. The court functioned on a system of patronage, with factions coalescing around powerful figures, all vying for the ultimate source of all light and heat, the king's favor. The Boleyns, in their rise, had displaced the old guard, creating a powerful and resentful bloc of enemies who were simply waiting for a moment of weakness. Men like the Duke of Norfolk, their own uncle, were fickle allies driven by their own ancient family pride and willing to sacrifice their kin to preserve their own standing. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, was a master of espionage, his dispatches to the emperor a running commentary of court gossip, slander, and political intelligence, painting Anne and George as corrupt, heretical agents of evil. The very architecture of the palaces, with their labyrinthine corridors, hidden alcoves, and interconnected chambers, facilitated a culture of eavesdropping. Servants were spies, ladies-in-waiting were informants, and even the most private conversations could be overheard, twisted, and weaponized. In this world, courtly love, the stylized, flirtatious game played by the aristocracy, was a dangerous charade. A witty compliment, a shared glance, a familiar touch of the hand-innocent gestures in one context could be reframed by enemies as evidence of adultery, and by extension, treason. George's relationship with his sister Anne was famously close. They were intellectual equals, confidants, and allies in a hostile world. They shared a similar sense of humor and a casual, tactile familiarity that was common among siblings but could be deliberately misinterpreted by those who sought their ruin. This closeness, a source of strength in their ascent, would become the proof of the most monstrous of libels. The air was thick with the scent of intrigue, a perfume of power and decay. The very floors seemed to have ears, the tapestries, eyes. It was a place where a single misstep, a careless word, or the king's sudden displeasure could mean a swift, silent transfer to the Tower of London. George Boleyn was a master of the courtly game, but he and his sister had changed the rules so fundamentally that they had alienated the other players. Now, those players, led by the master strategist Thomas Cromwell, were preparing to change the game again, turning the court from a stage for Boleyn triumph into the theater for their bloody and spectacular destruction. The first tremor, the hairline crack in the gilded mirror of Boleyn supremacy, was the devastating silence of the royal nursery. The kingdom, and more importantly, the king, had held its breath for a prince, the biological justification for a religious revolution, and the schism of Christendom. The birth of Elizabeth in 1533 was a profound disappointment, and with each passing year, each subsequent pregnancy that ended in miscarriage, that disappointment curdled into a cold, menacing fury within Henry. The miscarriage of a son in January 1536, on the very day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, was seen by the superstitious king as a dark omen, a sign of God's judgment. He began to believe, or was perhaps persuaded to believe, that his marriage to Anne was itself cursed, that he had been seduced by witchcraft, a convenient theological escape hatch that would absolve him of all responsibility. Anne's vibrant, argumentative, and often confrontational personality, which had so enchanted Henry during their long courtship, now began to grate on him. He desired a queen who was placid, obedient, and above all, fertile. His eyes and his favor began to drift towards the pale, quiet, and submissive Jane Seymour, a woman who was the physical and temperamental opposite of Anne. This shift in the king's affections was the political earthquake that shattered the Boleyns' foundation. As the king's love for Anne cooled, the power of her entire faction began to evaporate. Courtiers who had once flocked to her side now kept a cautious distance. Whispers grew louder, enemies grew bolder. George, as Anne's brother and most visible male supporter, was inextricably tied to her fate. Her failure to produce an heir was a reflection on the entire family. The divine mandate they had claimed was now being called into question. The charge of witchcraft that Henry muttered in private was not just an attack on Anne, it was an attack on the very legitimacy of their shared enterprise. If Anne was a witch, then what was George? Her warlock, her co-conspirator in a devilish plot to bewitch the king and usurp the throne. The atmosphere at court became thick with a new kind of dread. The danger was no longer external from Rome or the emperor but internal, emanating from the king's own chambers. Henry's charm, once the sun in which the Boleyns basked, was now showing its other face, that of a ruthless, paranoid tyrant, a man whose conscience was infinitely flexible when it came to his own desires. The fall was not yet in motion, but the ground beneath George Boleyn's feet had become treacherous and unstable. He was walking on a thinning sheet of ice, and he could hear it cracking with every step. The love story that had remade England was ending, and in the brutal logic of the Tudor court, its end could only be written in blood. As the king's favor receded from the Boleyns like a dying star, a new celestial body was reaching its zenith, Thomas Cromwell. A man of humble origins, a blacksmith's son who had risen through sheer, ruthless intelligence to become the king's chief minister. Cromwell was the ultimate pragmatist, a political engineer of unparalleled skill. He had been a key ally of the Boleyns, the man who had done the dirty legislative work of making the break with Rome a reality. He and George had worked together, two modern men forging a new state. But their alliance was a marriage of convenience, and as Anne's political stock plummeted, Cromwell saw an opportunity not just to survive, but to consolidate his own power absolutely. The reasons for his decision to turn on the Boleyns are debated by historians. Perhaps he genuinely believed Anne's continued presence was a threat to the stability of the realm and the succession. Perhaps he had a personal falling out with the Queen, who reportedly had a heated argument with him over the use of funds from the dissolved monasteries. Or perhaps, most likely, he was a political predator who sensed a fatal weakness in the dominant pride and moved in for the kill. Whatever his motive, once Cromwell decided the Boleyns had to go, he moved with terrifying speed and precision. He began to construct his web, a meticulous, patient, and deadly creation. He was the spymaster general, with agents and informants in every corner of the court. He understood its toxic culture intimately and knew precisely how to exploit it. He began to gather the threads of gossip, the half-truths, the careless words, the innocent gestures of courtly life. His agents, men like the Inquisitor John ap Rhys, were tasked with interrogating members of the Queen's circle, applying pressure, offering incentives, and seeking any scrap of information that could be twisted into something sinister. The investigation, if it can be called that, focused on the men of the Queen's privy chamber, those with the closest and most familiar access to her. Men like Henry Norris, a longtime friend of the king, Francis Weston, a young courtier, and William Brereton, a powerful gentleman from the Welsh marches. And, most vulnerably, a low-born musician named Mark Smeaton. Cromwell knew that a simple charge of adultery might not be enough to fell a queen and her powerful family. He needed something more, something so shocking, so monstrous, that it would stain the Boleyn name forever and make the king's actions seem not just justified, but righteous. He was not just an investigator, he was a writer, crafting a narrative of depravity and treason that would be presented to the king and a terrified court as undeniable fact. George Boleyn, the Queen's brilliant and confident brother, was to be the central villain in this dark fiction, second only to Anne herself. Cromwell's web was closing in, its strands invisible but made of steel, and at its center sat the king, a paranoid and suggestible spider, ready to be convinced that his house was infested and needed to be purged with fire. The masterstroke of Cromwell's plot, the accusation that elevated the affair from a mere political purge to an event of almost mythological horror, was the charge of incest. To accuse a queen of adultery was treasonous enough, but to accuse her of a sexual relationship with her own brother was to plunge the dagger into the very heart of nature, order, and divine law. It was a charge so foul, so profoundly taboo, that it transcended politics and entered the realm of the monstrous. This was Cromwell's genius, in its most diabolical form. The allegation of incest served multiple purposes with chilling efficiency. First, it utterly destroyed Anne's character in the public imagination. She was no longer just an unfaithful wife, but a creature of unnatural lusts, a moral leper. This made her execution, and the execution of her brother, not just a political necessity, but a moral cleansing, a righteous act to purge the kingdom of an unspeakable corruption. Second, it provided a convenient, albeit twisted, explanation for her failure to produce a healthy male heir. In the deeply superstitious mindset of the 16th century, the product of an incestuous union would surely be cursed by God, resulting in miscarriages or deformed offspring. This retroactively justified Henry's desperation for a new wife and absolved him of any fault. It reframed his desire for Jane Seymour from an act of lust to a pious duty to secure the succession with a pure and blessed womb. Third, and most crucially, the charge of incest entangled George Boleyn in a way that no other accusation could. A charge of simple treason, of plotting against the king, might have been difficult to prove against a man so recently in favor. But incest was a crime of the secret chamber, a sin of whispers and hidden desires. The evidence would not need to be concrete. It could be built from insinuation, from misinterpreted familiarity, from the coerced testimony of terrified witnesses. It created a closed loop of guilt. George's closeness to his sister was now proof of their conspiracy, and their conspiracy was incestuous. The very bond that had been a cornerstone of their family's strength was now pathologized, twisted into something grotesque and damnable. There is no credible historical evidence to support the charge. It was, by almost all accounts, a complete fabrication, a piece of black propaganda so potent that it has stained the memory of Anne and George for centuries. It was a lie designed to kill, and it was devastatingly effective. It transformed George from a political figure into a mythological monster, a participant in a Greek tragedy of his enemy's own writing. He was no longer to be seen as a reformer or a diplomat, but as a degenerate who had defiled his own blood and the royal bed. In the theater of the Tudor court, Cromwell had just unveiled his masterpiece of character assassination, and George Boleyn was about to be forced to play the lead role in his own damnation. The evidence that Cromwell's machine assembled was a grotesque tapestry woven from threads of torture, coercion, and malicious gossip, a testament to the fact that in a tyranny, truth is whatever the state declares it to be. The linchpin of the entire case was the confession of Mark Smeaton, a handsome court musician of humble birth. Unlike the other accused men who were aristocrats, Smeaton was a commoner and could be legally subjected to torture. He was taken to Cromwell's house in Stepney, and what happened there remains shrouded in darkness, but the outcome is clear. After what was almost certainly a brutal session on the rack or with other instruments of persuasion, Smeaton broke. He confessed to adultery with the Queen on 3 occasions. Whether he was promised his life in exchange for this lie, or whether he simply succumbed to unbearable agony, his confession was the crack in the dam. It lent an air of legitimacy to the entire proceeding, a single voice, however coerced, admitting guilt. With Smeaton's confession in hand, Cromwell's investigators turned their attention to the others, armed with the power of suggestion. The proofs against George were even more ethereal, resting entirely on hearsay and the testimony of his own wife, Jane Parker, Lady Rochford. Lady Rochford's role is one of history's great dark mysteries. She provided a statement, likely under immense pressure, listing instances of her husband's suspicious behavior. She reportedly claimed that Anne had told her that the king was not able to satisfy a woman and that he had neither skill nor virility. She also alleged that George and Anne were often alone together for long periods, and that he had once been seen in his sister's chambers early in the morning. These were not eyewitness accounts of a crime, but a collection of insinuations, decontextualized moments of familiarity between siblings, and secondhand gossip about the king's sexual prowess, a detail so inflammatory it was guaranteed to enrage Henry. Each detail, however flimsy, was another thread in the web. A courtly compliment from Sir Francis Weston to the Queen was twisted into evidence of an affair. A conversation Anne had with Sir Henry Norris, questioning his intent to marry her lady-in-waiting, was reframed as her attempting to lure him into her bed. It was a masterclass in confirmation bias, where every interaction with the Queen by any man was now seen through the dark lens of treasonous adultery. The specific charge against George, as read at his trial, alleged that he had committed incest with Anne at Whitehall and the long-demolished palace of Beaulieu. No specific dates were given, only a vague time frame. The evidence was the word of Lady Rochford and the supposed logic that if Anne was adulterous with 4 other men, it was plausible she would be so with her brother as well. It was a phantom case built on whispers and agony, a legal monstrosity designed not to find truth, but to ratify a predetermined verdict. George was to be condemned not by what he had done, but by what his enemies could make others say he had done. The collapse came with the brutal suddenness of a lightning strike on a summer's day. The 1st of May, 1536, was a day of celebration, a May Day tournament at Greenwich Palace. The Queen was in attendance, in the royal box, accompanied by her brother, George. The King was also present, presiding over the jousts. The atmosphere was festive, a spectacle of chivalry and courtly display. But beneath the surface, the gears of the conspiracy were grinding into their final position. Sir Henry Norris, one of the King's closest friends and a groom of the stool, was competing in the tournament. During the joust, his horse became unruly and refused to run. According to some accounts, Anne, in a moment of playful courtliness, dropped her handkerchief, and Norris used it to wipe his face. To the eyes of a suspicious king, already poisoned by Cromwell's whispers, this was not a gesture of chivalry but a flagrant signal of intimacy, a confirmation of his darkest fears. Suddenly, in the middle of the festivities, King Henry rose. His face was a mask of thunder. Without a word to the Queen, he left the royal box, taking a small party of his confidants with him, including Norris. They rode immediately for Westminster. The Queen, her brother, and the entire court were left in a state of stunned, bewildered silence. The public departure was a terrifying, unmistakable signal. Royal favor had not just been withdrawn, it had been violently severed. The axe was about to fall. The very next day, on May 2nd, George Boleyn was arrested. A summons came for him to appear before the King's Council. He likely went expecting to answer questions, to use his wit and reason to dispel whatever rumors were circulating. He was a nobleman, the Queen's brother, a man of power and influence. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the game now being played. He was not there to debate, he was there to be condemned. After a brief perfunctory interrogation, he was informed of the charges against him: treason, adultery, and the unspeakable crime of incest. He was then escorted down the river to the Tower of London, the infamous fortress prison from which few accused of treason ever returned. In the space of 48 hours, he had gone from being one of the most powerful men in England to a prisoner, stripped of his dignity, his freedom, and his future, facing the most horrific accusations imaginable. The speed was breathtaking, a calculated move by Cromwell to create shock and disarray, preventing the Boleyn faction from rallying or mounting any kind of defense. The gates of the tower clanged shut behind Viscount Rochford, and the golden age of the Boleyns was officially and bloodily over. The Tower of London was more than a prison. It was a state of mind, a cold stone purgatory where the powerful were brought to contemplate their mortality. For George Boleyn, confinement within its ancient walls must have been a unique form of psychological torture. He was not thrown into a common dungeon. As a nobleman, he would have been held in relative comfort, likely in the Beauchamp Tower, granted his own servants and a degree of physical amenity. But this comfort would have only amplified the mental anguish. The tower was a symbol of the very state he had helped to build. Its stones were witnesses to the brutal logic of Tudor power, a logic he had once championed and was now a victim of. From his window, he might have been able to see the Queen's lodgings, the very apartments where his sister Anne was also imprisoned, a captive in the same rooms where she had awaited her coronation just 3 years earlier. This proximity, the knowledge that his sister, the person with whom he shared the deepest bond of intellect and affection, was just a few hundred yards away, enduring the same nightmare, must have been an agony beyond measure. He was isolated, cut off from the world, with only the whispers of his jailers and the turmoil of his own thoughts for company. He, the master debater, the eloquent diplomat, was now silenced, his fate being decided in rooms he could not enter, by men who had once been his colleagues and rivals. The charge of incest, so absurd and monstrous, would have circled his mind relentlessly. How does one even begin to refute such a grotesque fantasy? It was a smear designed to be irrefutable, a stain that clung like poison. There was also the profound sense of betrayal. Betrayal by the king he had served and admired, a man he had considered a friend and intellectual peer. Betrayal by his own wife, whose testimony, he would soon learn, formed the rotten core of the case against him. And betrayal by the political system he had believed in, a system of law that was now being perverted into a tool of judicial murder. We have accounts that during his imprisonment, he was visited by theologians, perhaps sent to secure a confession or to prepare his soul for the inevitable. But George, the fervent reformer, reportedly engaged them in fierce theological debate, his mind still sharp, his spirit, it seemed, not yet broken. He was a man confronting the abyss, stripped of everything but his intellect and his faith. The weight, the uncertainty of the exact nature of his downfall, the gnawing horror of the accusation sit, was all part of a deliberate process to break the spirit of the condemned before they were brought to the final theater of their trial. The Tower was the antechamber to the scaffold, a place designed to dismantle a man piece by piece, long before the executioner ever lifted his axe. For George Boleyn, it was the place where the brilliant, sunlit world he had known was extinguished, replaced by the damp, chilling reality of his own imminent and orchestrated death. Before the main event, the show trial of the Queen and her brother, there was a curtain raiser designed to establish a narrative of guilt and ensure the outcome was never in doubt. On the 12th of May, 1536, the four commoners accused alongside the Boleyns, Sir Francis Weston, Sir Henry Norris, Sir William Brereton, and the musician Mark Smeaton were brought to trial at Westminster Hall. It was a legal formality, a piece of political theater whose script had already been written by Thomas Cromwell. The four men were charged with high treason for committing adultery with Queen Anne and with conspiring the king's death. The evidence presented was the same flimsy collection of hearsay and forced confessions that underpinned the entire case. The atmosphere in the hall would have been electric with fear and anticipation. The judges and the jury were not impartial arbiters of justice. They were men of the court, acutely aware of the king's wishes and the mortal danger of defying them. Three of the men, Weston, Norris, and Brereton, all being aristocrats who had not been subjected to torture, steadfastly and courageously maintained their innocence. They pleaded not guilty to all charges. Sir Henry Norris, a man who had been a close and trusted friend of King Henry for years, was reportedly offered a pardon if he would only confess and implicate the Queen. It was a tempting offer, a lifeline in a sea of despair, but Norris refused. He would not save his own life by condemning his queen with a lie, a final act of loyalty and courage that stood in stark contrast to the craven political maneuvering that surrounded him. But one man's plea was different. Mark Smeaton, the musician, the man who had been broken in Cromwell's house, pleaded guilty. His single whispered word of guilt was all the prosecution needed. It was the proof, the corroboration that lent a veneer of truth to the entire fabrication. His confession, extracted under duress, now poisoned the well for the other three. It didn't matter that they denied the charges. Smeaton's plea created the impression of a vast, depraved conspiracy. The jury, comprised of men who knew the accused, who had jousted and dined with them, took very little time to deliberate. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. All four men were found guilty. The sentence was read, the most brutal the law allowed for treason. They were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This barbaric ritual, a public spectacle of disembowelment and mutilation, was the price of the king's fury and Cromwell's ambition. The trial of the commoners was a crucial success for the prosecution. It established a legal precedent of guilt, solidifying the story of the Queen's rampant infidelity in the minds of the court and the public. It created an atmosphere of inevitability. If these four men were guilty, then surely the Queen, the central figure in their alleged crimes, must be guilty as well. And if the Queen was guilty, then what hope was there for her brother, the man accused of the most monstrous sin of all? The stage was now set for the final act. 3 days later, on May 15, 1536, the Great Hall of the Tower of London was transformed into a courtroom for the most sensational trial in English history. This was not a trial of commoners, but of royalty and the highest nobility. Anne Boleyn, the Queen of England, and her brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, were to be tried by a jury of their peers, a panel of 26 noblemen presided over by their own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. The spectacle was thick with a terrible, tragic irony. The man who sat in judgment, Norfolk, was a political rival who had long resented the Boleyns' influence and now held their lives in his hands. The jury was filled with men who had prospered under the Boleyns, men who had bowed to Anne as their queen and laughed at George's jokes at the royal dinner table. Now, their faces were grim, their eyes averted, their minds already made up. The gallery was packed with spectators, a cross-section of the English elite, all there to witness the final, brutal act of the Boleyn tragedy. First, Queen Anne was brought before the court. She entered with a calm and dignified composure that stunned the onlookers. She listened as the long, lurid indictment was read out, detailing the charges of adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother, and conspiring the king's death. The evidence, such as it was presented: the coerced confession of Smeaton, the hearsay from Lady Rochford, the twisted interpretations of courtly flirtations. By all accounts, Anne defended herself brilliantly. She answered each charge with intelligence, logic, and a quiet confidence, exposing the absurdity and lack of substance in the prosecution's case. She created such a powerful impression that for a moment an observer might have believed an acquittal was possible. But it was an illusion. The verdict was already written. After her trial, she was led away, and her brother George was brought in to face the same tribunal. He too entered with an air of defiance and intellectual self-assurance. He was, after all, one of the great debaters of his generation, a man renowned for his quick mind and silver tongue. He was not just fighting for his life, he was fighting for his honor, his family's name, and the truth, in a room that had no place for it. The same charges were read against him: treason through incest and conspiracy. The sight of these 2 siblings, the architects of a new England, being systematically and publicly dismantled by the very state they had helped create, was a chilling demonstration of absolute power. The law was not a shield for the innocent, it was a weapon for the king, and Cromwell was aiming it directly at the hearts of the 2 people who stood in the way of his new order. The trial was a meticulously staged piece of theater, and its purpose was not justice, but justification. In the face of a foregone conclusion, George Boleyn mounted a defense that was remembered for its brilliance, its courage, and its fatal, defiant recklessness. He stood before the jury of his peers, men he knew well, and he fought. He listened to the charges, a litany of manufactured horrors, and then, with the forensic skill of a lawyer and the passion of a wronged man, he began to dissect the prosecution's case, or rather, the lack thereof. He addressed each point, refuting the vague timelines and the fantastical allegations with logic and reason. He spoke with the eloquence for which he was famous, his voice ringing with confidence through the cavernous hall. He commanded the space, and for a while, he seemed to be winning the argument, if not the case. The spectators were reportedly impressed by his spirited defense. He made the charges appear as flimsy and ridiculous as they were. But then came the moment that sealed his fate, an act of such audacious defiance that it left the court breathless. The prosecution presented as evidence a piece of paper, a note detailing the alleged conversation between Anne and Lady Rochford, in which the Queen had supposedly questioned the king's sexual abilities, claiming he had neither skill nor virility. The details were considered so scandalous, so insulting to the king's honor and masculinity, that the prosecutor did not read them aloud, simply summarizing the note's treasonous nature. He then handed the paper to George. What happened next was extraordinary. In an act of either supreme arrogance or desperate transparency, George took the note and read its contents aloud to the entire court. A collective gasp must have filled the hall. He had just publicly aired the most intimate and damning insult imaginable against the famously thin-skinned and egotistical Henry VIII. In that moment, he broke the unwritten rule of the Tudor court. You did not, under any circumstances, publicly humiliate the king. His reasons for doing so are debated. Was it a calculated gamble to show the jury how ludicrous the evidence was, based on nothing more than salacious and unverifiable gossip from his estranged wife? Or was it an act of pure, frustrated rage, a final suicidal gesture of defiance from a man who knew he was already condemned and wanted to expose the sordid nature of the conspiracy against him. Whatever the motive, it was a catastrophic error in judgment. He had won the debate but lost his life. The insult to the king's virility was an unforgivable offense, a personal attack that transformed a political trial into a matter of personal vengeance. The jury, who might have harbored some sliver of doubt, now had no choice. To acquit George would be to validate the insult against the king. They would be signing their own death warrants. George's brilliant defense had been undone by a single, reckless act, a flash of his old, defiant wit that proved to be his last. He had proven he was a better debater than his accusers, but in doing so, he had confirmed he was a dead man. The verdict was now a mere formality, a ritual to conclude the grim theater. After George Boleyn's shocking recitation of the king's alleged inadequacies, the mood in the great hall shifted from one of legal process to one of impending doom. The jury of peers, their faces pale and set, withdrew. They did not need to deliberate for long. Their choice was simple: condemn one man or risk the fury of an insulted and omnipotent king. They returned, and the Duke of Norfolk, their uncle, emotionlessly asked for their verdict. The foreman, the Earl of Sussex, declared George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, guilty of all charges. The sentence was then pronounced by Norfolk, a man condemning his own nephew to a hideous death. The words would have echoed in the cold air of the hall. George Boleyn was to be taken back to the Tower of London, and from there to the place of execution, where he was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was the full, terrifying penalty for high treason reserved for commoners, a three-part ritual of public agony designed as the ultimate deterrent. The condemned would be hanged until they were nearly unconscious, then cut down. While still alive, their abdomen would be sliced open, and their intestines and genitals would be cut out and burned before their own eyes. Finally, they would be beheaded, and their body hacked into 4 quarters, which would then be displayed on spikes in prominent locations as a gruesome warning to others. As this horrific fate was read out, George Boleyn reportedly reacted with composure, but he addressed the court one last time. He did not beg for his life. Instead, he made a series of practical requests, asking that his debts be paid from his confiscated estate, a final attempt to maintain his honor and ensure his affairs were in order. It was the act of a man who had accepted his fate and was now looking beyond his own death. Sometime after the trial, the king, in a small, almost perverse act of mercy, commuted the sentences of George and the other 4 condemned gentlemen. They would not be subjected to the full barbarity of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Instead, they were granted the nobleman's death, a single, swift stroke of the headsman's axe. This was not an act of compassion. It was a pragmatic decision to avoid a prolonged and potentially sympathetic public spectacle of suffering for well-known aristocrats. The outcome was the same: death. The trials were over. The Boleyns had been legally, if not justly, condemned. The system of law had served its purpose, providing the king with the justification he needed. Now, all that remained was the final, bloody act of execution. In the 2 days that separated the sentence from its execution, George Boleyn was a man suspended between 2 worlds. The frantic, intellectual battle of the trial was over, and the physical finality of the block lay just ahead. This liminal space was a time for spiritual and practical preparation, a final reckoning with God and with his own legacy. Confined once more in the Tower, he was now officially a dead man walking. According to the dispatches of the ever-watchful imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, George dedicated these final hours to his faith. He reportedly spent much of his time with his almoner, engaging in prayer and religious contemplation. For a man who had been a passionate and driving force of the English Reformation, this was a final, crucial test of his beliefs. He was facing the ultimate question, the one that lay at the end of all theological debate. How does a man of faith meet his end? Did his evangelical convictions, which had promised a more direct and personal relationship with God, provide him solace now? The accounts suggest they did. He was said to have displayed a remarkable fortitude and a calm acceptance of his fate, viewing his death through the lens of a Christian preparing to meet his Maker. He was also a man of letters, a poet, and it is in this period that he is traditionally believed to have composed his final work, a poem titled Farewell, My Lute. While its authorship is debated by scholars, the poem's themes of betrayal, resignation, and the silencing of a once-celebrated voice resonate powerfully with his situation. The poem speaks of a lute that must now be silent, for its songs have bred my smart and procured my pain. It is a lament for a life of courtly performance that has ended in disaster, a poignant farewell from a man whose wit and words, once his greatest assets, had become the instruments of his destruction. Whether he wrote it or not, the sentiment captures the tragic arc of his life. He also focused on worldly matters, ensuring his substantial debts were recorded so that they might be settled. This concern for his financial obligations, even on the brink of death, speaks to a man deeply invested in his own honor and reputation, wanting to leave the world with a clean slate, at least in the eyes of his creditors. He was trying to exert one last fragment of control over a life that had been so violently wrested from him. These last 48 hours were a period of intense, condensed living, a final stripping away of all earthly titles and ambitions, leaving only a man, his faith, and the looming shadow of the axe. It was a quiet, somber interlude before the noise and horror of the public execution on Tower Hill. The morning of May 17, 1536, dawned gray and ominous over London. On Tower Hill, just outside the fortress walls, a large black-draped scaffold had been erected, a stark stage for the final act of this political tragedy. A large crowd had gathered, a sea of expectant faces, drawn by the morbid spectacle of high-born men being brought low. They were about to witness the systematic eradication of the Queen's faction. The 5 condemned men were led out from the tower: Sir Francis Weston, Sir Henry Norris, Sir William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and at their head, as the highest-ranking nobleman among them, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. The procession was solemn, a grim parade of the fallen. They were to be executed one by one, a slow, methodical demonstration of the king's power. The order of execution was dictated by rank, starting from the lowest. Mark Smeaton, the musician whose coerced confession had been the key to the entire plot, was the first to die. He was followed by Brereton, Weston, and then Norris, the king's former friend who had refused a pardon in exchange for a lie. Each man mounted the scaffold, offered a short, conventional speech, and then knelt to place his head upon the block. The sound of the axe falling, the sight of blood, the reactions of the crowd, it was a repetitive, brutal ritual that built the tension for the main event. Finally, it was George's turn. He ascended the wooden steps of the scaffold with a reported air of composure and dignity. He was a man known for his fine clothes and confident bearing, and even in these last moments, he presented the image of a nobleman. He looked out over the crowd, a collection of Londoners, merchants, and fellow courtiers who had come to see him die. He was facing the city he had helped to govern, under the sky of the kingdom he had helped to reform. The executioner, a professional likely brought over from Calais for his skill, stood ready, his axe glinting in the pale morning light. The block, a simple piece of wood, was already stained with the blood of the men who had preceded him. This was the most visceral moment of the narrative, the reduction of a complex, brilliant man to mere flesh and bone, a body subject to the absolute and brutal power of the state. All the debates, the diplomacy, the poetry, and the power had led to this single, primitive moment: a man, a block, and a blade. The air was heavy with the smell of sawdust, sweat, and spilled blood. The final seconds of his life were ticking away, measured by the nervous silence of the crowd and the steady rhythm of his own heart. On the scaffold, with the eyes of London upon him, George Boleyn delivered his final public performance. It was not a fiery proclamation of his innocence, nor was it a bitter condemnation of his enemies. To have done so would have been a dangerous, futile gesture. Protesting one's innocence of treason could be interpreted as a final act of treason itself, potentially jeopardizing the chance for a quick death and bringing further persecution upon one's family. Instead, following the grim convention for the condemned of the era, he delivered a speech that was a carefully constructed blend of piety, contrition, and subtle messaging. He began by addressing the crowd, acknowledging that he was there to die. "Christian men," he reportedly began, "I am come hither to die, forasmuch as I am condemned by the law to die, and I will not grudge thereat." He confessed not to the specific crimes for which he was sentenced to incest and treason, but to being a sinner in a more general, theological sense. "I have been a great reader and a great setter forth of the word of God," he declared, "but I have been a great doer of the same. I have lived a vicious and a sinful life." This was a standard formula, an admission of general human frailty that was expected of a man on the brink of meeting his God. But for George, the great champion of the Reformation, it carried a particular weight. He was admitting that his personal conduct had not lived up to the high scriptural ideals he had publicly espoused. He was, in a sense, making a public act of penance. Then, he delivered a warning that seemed to be aimed directly at his fellow courtiers, the ambitious men who still played the game he had lost. He cautioned them against the vanities of the court and the dangers of relying on the flattering promises of the world. He spoke of how his own pride and fleshly and worldly desires had brought him to this shameful end. It was a moral sermon delivered from the most dramatic of pulpits. Crucially, he did not mention his sister, nor did he speak of the king. He asked for the crowd's prayers and for God's forgiveness, and then he knelt. He placed his head on the block. The executioner raised the heavy axe. With a single, swift blow, the life of George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, poet, diplomat, and reformer, was extinguished. His speech remains a subject of interpretation. Was it a sincere expression of a man whose faith had deepened in the face of death? Or was it a masterful, pragmatic performance designed to protect his family, settle his conscience with God, and leave behind the memory not of a traitor, but of a flawed but pious Christian nobleman? In the end, it was likely both. A complex final statement from a complex man. The immediate aftermath of the executions on Tower Hill was a swift and chilling display of political consolidation. As George Boleyn's head was lifted for the crowd to see, a final, gruesome confirmation of death, a chapter of English history was slammed shut. His body, along with those of the other 4 men, was unceremoniously taken for burial in the grounds of the tower itself, interred in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vinculath, Chapel of St. Peter in Chains. It was a place reserved for the most famous victims of the Tudor state, a final, ignominious resting place. He would be joined there just 2 days later by his sister, Anne, who was executed within the tower walls by a French swordsman. With their deaths, the Boleyn faction was not just defeated, it was annihilated. Their crests were torn down, their names maligned, and their power completely erased. The court, which had trembled during the trials, now breathed a collective sigh of relief and immediately realigned itself to the new reality. The new son was Jane Seymour. In a move of almost indecent haste, King Henry VIII became formally betrothed to Jane on May 20th, just 1 day after Anne's execution, and married her 10 days later. The political world moved on with brutal speed, eager to forget the bloody unpleasantness of the preceding weeks. The official narrative, carefully crafted by Cromwell, was now cemented. Anne and her co-conspirators were monsters of depravity, their executions a necessary and righteous purge that had saved the king and the kingdom. The incest charge, in particular, served its purpose perfectly, making the entire Boleyn project seem rotten to its core. Cromwell's power was now absolute. He had successfully navigated the king's marital desires, eliminated a powerful rival faction, and demonstrated to all that he was the indispensable minister, the man who could solve any problem, no matter how messy. He was the master of the state, second only to the king himself, but even his victory was temporary in the treacherous world of the Tudor court. The man who had sent George Boleyn to the block for a phantom crime, the architect of his judicial murder, would himself meet the same fate just 4 years later, executed for treason on the very same spot on Tower Hill, a victim of the same lethal political machinery he had perfected. The axe that fell for George Boleyn in 1536 was simply being sharpened for its next victim. The immediate consequence of his death was the triumphant rise of his enemies, but the blood spilt that day would create a cycle of violence and retribution that would continue to turn for years to come. The story of George Boleyn's fall was immediately subject to intense propaganda, a deliberate campaign to shape his legacy into one of villainy and perversion. History, as it is so often, was written by the executioners. The official state narrative, disseminated through court circulars and ambassadorial dispatches influenced by Cromwell, painted a picture of a man whose brilliant exterior hid a soul corrupted by ambition and unnatural lust. The incest charge was the cornerstone of this character assassination. It was so effective that for centuries, George was remembered primarily for this one, likely fabricated, accusation. He was reduced from a complex political and intellectual figure to a one-dimensional monster, a footnote in his sister's more famous tragedy, the incestuous brother who sealed her doom. Central to this narrative, both then and now, is the enigmatic and tragic figure of his wife, Jane Parker, Lady Rochford. Her testimony, whether given freely or coerced, was the only evidence for the incest charge. For this, history has branded her a treacherous villain, a jealous wife who sent her husband and sister-in-law to their deaths out of spite. The Spanish ambassador Chapuis wrote that she was motivated by a fit of jealousy, and this interpretation has persisted. However, a more nuanced view suggests she was a woman trapped in an impossible situation, a pawn in Cromwell's deadly game. She was likely interrogated, threatened, and pressured into providing the statements he needed. To refuse would have been to risk being accused of treason herself. Her own fate is a dark testament to the dangers of the Tudor court. 5 years later, as a lady-in-waiting to Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, she was implicated in the Queen's adulterous affairs. Accused of facilitating them, she was arrested, went mad in the Tower, and was executed on Tower Green in 1542. Her end was as tragic as the one she helped bring about for her husband. The legacy of George Boleyn himself has been gradually re-evaluated. Historians now see him not as the monster of Cromwell's propaganda, but as a key figure of the English Reformation, a talented and influential man who was a victim of a ruthless political coup. His advocacy for reform, his diplomatic skill, and his intellectual contributions are now recognized as central to his story. He was not collateral damage in Anne's fall, he was a primary target. His removal was essential for Cromwell and the conservative faction to halt the radical religious agenda the Boleyns championed. The propaganda that destroyed him in his time was so powerful that it has taken nearly 500 years of scholarship to begin to dismantle it and see the man behind the monstrous caricature. In the final analysis, the execution of George Boleyn resonates far beyond the bloody politics of the Tudor court, echoing through the centuries as a timeless and chilling exploration of power, justice, and mortality. His story is a stark reminder of the terrifying fragility of a life lived in the shadow of an absolute monarch. George was a man who possessed everything the Renaissance prized: intellect, charm, education, and influence. Yet all of it was rendered meaningless by a single shift in the king's favor. His fate demonstrates a brutal truth. In a system of absolute power, law is not a shield but a weapon, and loyalty is a currency with a constantly fluctuating value. His trial was a perversion of justice, a show trial where the verdict was delivered before the evidence was heard, a phenomenon that has been repeated in countless totalitarian regimes throughout history. The use of sexual slander, specifically the monstrous charge of incest, as a political tool to utterly dehumanize an opponent, is a tactic that remains chillingly familiar in the modern world. It serves to remove the victim from the realm of political disagreement and place them into a category of the morally untouchable, making their destruction seem not only necessary but righteous. Furthermore, the story of George Boleyn is a tragedy of a reformer consumed by the very revolution he helped to ignite. He was a true believer in a new kind of England, a nation free from the authority of Rome, guided by scripture and intellectual inquiry. He pushed for this change with passion and conviction, only to be devoured by the paranoid, unstable state that emerged. He helped unleash a tiger, believing he could control it, and was ultimately consumed by it when it turned on its masters. His death symbolizes the moment the English Reformation lurched from an intellectual and theological movement into a brutal instrument of state terror, wielded by a paranoid king and his ruthless minister. George Boleyn was not just Anne's brother, dragged into a bloodbath. He was a formidable political and intellectual force in his own right, and his execution was a calculated act of political assassination designed to eliminate a leader of the reformist cause. The axe that severed his head was an attempt to sever the future he envisioned for England, leaving a legacy written not in the ink of his poetry and diplomacy, but in the blood that soaked the boards of the scaffold on Tower Hill.